things we probably won't do are really important for our partners in the region.
And with regard to your second point about the Israeli-Palestinian issues, is there a way that you think we can use the positive energy of these accords to encourage the Abraham Accord countries to have a positive impact on improving relationships between the Israelis and the Palestinians?
Well, I absolutely believe that's to be true. I think doing progress in one area, I think, it gives way to progress in other areas, I think it's important for people in the region to see the definitive progress and improvements that are being made as a result of the Abraham Accord process and the arrangements that are in place, because they give indications of areas where we can do this, where we can make progress in other areas. I don't know that it can directly address that issue, but the important part of the Abraham Accords is the fact that it provides a platform for dialogue. It provides a platform for interaction. It provides a way for the countries of the Gulf and Israel to have candid discussions and to move forward in critical areas that are of mutual interest.
Thank you so much. I have about 12 more questions, but in fairness, I will yield back.
Thank you very much, Congresswoman Kathy Manning. And indeed, we're so fortunate with scheduling. The first person who came to the Middle East subcommittee meeting for 2023 was Congressman Brian Mast. He was here first, and so he gets all that credit, except for one thing. We're all bouncing different meetings, so he had to go to another meeting too. But he should be remembered as number one. To be here, and so, but then that shifts all the way from Florida to Indiana, of all things. Congressman Jim Baird.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I'd just say that most of my questions have been answered, one of which was the Palestinian-Israeli relationship, and I think you discussed that. So I'll pass, Mr. Chairman. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Congressman Baird, and we now proceed immediately to Congressman Brad Sherman of California.
Thank you. As to an opening comment, I don't think any of us trust the Iranian regime, but I do think we have to negotiate with them, just as Roosevelt negotiated with Stalin and Nixon negotiated with Mao. We are embracing the Abrahamic Accords, but we should remember that as to real diplomatic relations, it remains somewhat stalled, both as regards Sudan and Morocco. It looks like the Saudis, Ambassador, are pushing for U.S. cooperation with their supposedly peaceful nuclear program. And as I've pointed out to some friends of Israel, just because the Saudis are not Shiites does not mean that they are Zionists. And I saw a close relationship the United States had with the Shah, and every weapon the Shah had was then in the hands of the Ayatollahs. So we don't want to see we don't particularly want to see a nuclear-armed Saudi Arabia. The UAE entered a gold standard level of assurance that they wouldn't be using their peaceful program for military purposes. The Saudis seem very reluctant to do that. And of course, bin Salman has hinted, well, if the Iranians have a nuclear weapon, then we ought to have a nuclear weapon. Does Saudi Arabia want cooperation with a peaceful program with all the safeguards, or do they just want to be able to respond to the Iranian nuclear weapons program?
Thank you, Congressman. I think the Saudis obviously have made clear in every forum that they view Iran as their most significant threat. It's not only the nuclear program of Iran, it's also the proxies in Yemen and elsewhere who have attacked Saudi Arabia. And General Votel mentioned the attack on Abqaiq. And so they're rightfully concerned and rightfully seek the kind of assurances from the United States as their key security partner that would help them defend themselves.
Why are they reluctant to sign the safeguards their close neighbor has signed?
first of all, there's some rivalry between Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates. I think that is actually increasing over time, and there may be a factor of what the UAE wants, the Saudis want, and plus a little bit more. But it is also, I think, what one would expect almost at the beginning of any negotiation. The gold standard 1, 2, 3 agreement achieved with the United Arab Emirates took many years to negotiate. And so if the Saudis are serious about wanting U.S. civil nuclear technology cooperation as part of a settlement, they would need to come to a serious negotiation about that.
I would just say that diplomatic relations and niceties can be reversed, governments can be overthrown, but nuclear weapons or nuclear weapons technology stays where it is. And thank God, while we did a lot for the military of the Shah, none of it was in the nuclear area. The ambassador of the UAE has stated the truth of the Abraham Accords was about preventing annexation. The reason it happened the way it happened. The reason it happened the way it happened. To prevent annexation. To prevent annexation. Are we? To what extent does some of the comments made more recently by the Netanyahu regime government about annexing parts of the West Bank conflict with either the letter or the spirit of the Abrahamic Accords?
Well, it is true that at the time that the Abraham Accords were signed, the Emirates did make clear that they expected what was then being discussed in Israel, which was a partial annexation of the West Bank, to be shelved, and there was such a commitment by Israel. So to have some Israeli members of the Israeli government speak about de facto annexation or to take actions that might be consistent with de facto annexation, even if it's called something else, obviously raises questions about whether that commitment is upheld. But I think more concerning is whether, of course, it also could mean the death of any possibility of a two-state solution, but how that development would influence and impact the possibility of future expansion of the Abraham Accords. The Saudis may not prioritize the Palestinian issue as their #1 priority in this, nor may other Arab states looking at this, and yet the polling we've seen about the relatively low popularity of the Accords suggests the Palestinian issue is at least part of the reason for that. And if we see two states receding over the cliff and annexation pushing it there, I think that will make it harder to achieve the goal we're all here to discuss.
And finally, I'll just point out that in addition to the Abrahamic Accords, the Biden administration's brokerage of an agreement with Lebanon on maritime and exploitation of the natural gas resources, and their negotiation with regard to Egypt and Saudi Arabia and Israel over the islets at the Gulf, at the mouth of the Gulf of Aqaba. They may not be Abrahamic, but they're important. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Congressman Sherman. And I'm happy you brought up about the Biden administration's success for the drilling in the Mediterranean, how important that's going to be for the economy of Lebanon, how beneficial it is for Israel, and to show how things connect. And that is that he didn't brag about it enough. The oil that is achieved by Israel is sent to Egypt, of all things, to be refined, to be sent to Italy to reduce any dependency on Putin. And so that was a tremendous achievement of offshore drilling in the Mediterranean. With that in mind, indeed, the very first person to be here for the very first Middle East, North Africa, Central Asia subcommittee is here, Congressman Brian Mast.
Thank you, Chairman. I appreciate it. I want to start with just giving my own personal analysis on the last comments that you made about two-state. You mentioned it briefly, so I'm just going to mention my opinions on it. I think two-state should be left dead. In my opinion, it makes no sense to me that the United States of America work to make a state out of an entity that would have to immediately be labeled as a terrorist state and a state that we would immediately in Congress begin coming up with sanctions for. So personally, that's my analysis of the situation. My question goes to you, General, and it's about what was spoken about, the communication that's taking place, the diplomacy that's taking place, and stability that can take place between different entities. But I want to ask if the Abraham Accords are leading to communication in another place. Right? We have the Abraham Accords taking place. We have a de facto separation between Gaza and the West Bank for 2 decades, let's say. It's well assumed by many that if there were to be a real election held, that Hamas would win a popular election across those two de facto areas. Are the Abraham Accords resulting in an increased communication between Gaza and the West Bank to one way or another change that relationship from de facto separation to officially separated, or somehow united under the PA, or united under Hamas, or in some other ways? Is it resulting in that over there?
Congressman, to be very truthful with you, I'm not sure I can make a conclusion one way or the other on that. Some of the other panelists may be in a better position to comment on that. I think tangentially it could have some influence, frankly, in terms of uniting some folks in those particular areas around certain issues. So I think there may be some tangential issues, but in terms of something more substantive in influence, and I'm not sure. I haven't seen that, and I may not be the best person to conclude that.
Thank you, John. And I don't know that we would necessarily see it or that it would be evident to us, but I would certainly welcome the opinions from both of you as well about if you're seeing that. That's something I'm just particularly curious about, because I think is wherever people stand on wanting to see two-state or not two-state, or however they see peace, long-lasting peace and stability in that region taking place, that's something that has to be addressed, is that separation of those two entities. And I don't see it being looked at a lot, so I'd be curious to know your all's analysis as well.
Thanks, Congressman. I would say that the direct answer to your question is I don't think that's the case now. I think the perspective of the Accords members before and after the agreement was that they could better contribute to setting conditions for an eventual brokered settlement, whatever that might be, by being a member of the Accords and having normalized diplomatic relations with Israel. And they point to both Egypt and Jordan as examples of this, where their influence over Israel, positive and negative, would contribute to an ultimate resolution, one that they would frankly admit is not currently within sight. And I think there's merit to that argument. Second is I think there's a material way for them to contribute to the conversation and to set conditions. And I think that that has probably not been exploited to the degree to which it could. And one of the ways in which I mentioned up front in my opening remarks, and one of the ways we established early on with the Accords, was a fund to allow Accord member countries to contribute to infrastructure investment within the territories that was both acceptable to Israel and to the Palestinians and to the benefit of both. And I think there is ample opportunity for that to continue to occur while we're waiting for the resolution of a more difficult political question.
Thank you, sir.
Congressman, I think the attitude of the Palestinian Authority to the Abraham Accords has been very disappointing. They, of course, have called it a betrayal and essentially boycotted it. Of course, Hamas, that rules Gaza, is a terrorist organization that rejects Israel's existence. They're obviously not going to be a party. I do think there are different views among the Palestinian people, a younger generation, business people, people who are open to the idea that Palestinians could benefit and contribute if they were participating in these dialogues. What I hope is that we will see, we try to do this in our programs, but I think the Arab states that have normalized with Israel, the UAE, Bahrain, Morocco in particular, are well positioned to be conveners in forums where both Israelis and Palestinians participate, look for ways to cooperate, develop some personal relationships, lower suspicion. That may not get us to the resolution that I would like to see of a two-state solution or any resolution of the conflict, but it would certainly lower the barriers to an eventual resumption of negotiations and some kind of resolution by developing this. I think these Arab states have more influence in that arena than they may realize they do, and that we should encourage them to use it.
I appreciate you all taking the time to testify today, and I yield no time back because I have no time left.
Thank you very much, Congressman Brian Mast. And we now proceed to former Chairman David Cicilline.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I congratulate you on your first hearing as chairman of this important committee, and thank the witnesses for being with us today and for your testimony. I think we all recognize that the Abraham Accords was really an important and historic breakthrough on building and maintaining peace in the Middle East through new and extended regional cooperation. And as we acknowledge the successes of these agreements, I'm really optimistic about the opportunity that lies ahead to build on these historic achievements. Additional engagement and partnerships will allow for cooperation on key issues which you've discussed. And I, of course, am looking forward to ways in which Congress can help support efforts to deepen and broaden the Abraham Accords and a better future for all in the region. As you mentioned, Ambassador Shapiro, one of the main impediments to expanding the Abraham Accords has been the Israeli-Palestinian issue, and Saudi Arabia, Kuwait, Qatar, and Oman have all indicated to various extents their interest in stabilizing relations with Israel, but not without significant steps towards peace. And so what I'm wondering is if you have recommendations on the kinds of things that we might be suggesting to our State Department in these conversations that would provide some engagement with the Palestinians, some benefits, so they would see the Abraham Accords is not only bringing more peace and stability to the region, but actual benefits to them.
Sure. Thank you, Congressman. The kinds of projects that have already been announced, for example, the Prosperity Green and Prosperity Blue solar energy for desalinated water exchange between Jordan and Israel, financed by the United Arab Emirates, is a very good example of a project that could have and should, I think, include the Palestinians. They're obviously in the same geographic area. They have similar needs for energy and water. They could be a contributor, but also a beneficiary of that and 10 other joint projects like it. I discussed the idea that the UAE can be a convener of the kinds of exchanges where Israelis and Palestinians outside their own immediate environment can actually meet with their mutual Arab partners to do business deals, to do development projects, to do education initiatives. And just by doing that, it shows that there is something to be gained for Palestinians by contributing. It's not going to answer all of their immediate needs. It's not going to start a negotiation tomorrow, and certainly the lack of trust, almost total lack of trust, between Israeli and Palestinian leaders is a big barrier. We're not going to overcome that tomorrow. But I do think those parties with U.S. sponsorship and organization can draw Palestinians into these dialogues with Israelis and with their other Arab partners and change that dynamic rather dramatically.
Thank you. And I think we all recognize this past year has been one of the deadliest periods of violence in the West Bank in nearly 2 decades. And I'm wondering whether you, General, or you, Ambassador, or President Greenway, have thoughts on whether or not the partners to the Abraham Accords have been helpful, and can they be helpful in terms of assisting and responding to some of the violence and brokering some kinds of agreements because of their new positions as members of the Abraham Accords. Has that proved useful, or has that not really spilled over into some of these issues with respect to settlement expansion?
Okay. The UAE is struggling with this. They're a member of the UN Security Council. They have several times in the last 2 or 3 months brought complaints on behalf of other Arab countries to the UN Security Council about statements or actions by Israel in the West Bank. I don't think they've been as consistently critical as I think they should be of Palestinian terrorist attacks that take the lives of Israelis, or indeed of Palestinian Authority salaries paid to terrorists. But again, it's a demonstration that they are positioned to play a role as both a supporter of both. They're now friends with Israel, and nobody would want them to withhold any of that, but also friends and partners of the Palestinians. They can be supporters, they can be coaches, they can put some positive pressure on each side to avoid the things that make it harder, or they keep the situation on the ground very tense, or make it harder to resume negotiations. I'd like to see them step more into that role. Obviously, that should be done in coordination with the United States.
Congressman, I completely agree with the Ambassador. I think the key point here is that the maturing of the Abraham Accord relationships will really give the opportunity for trustful communication between the partners in the arrangement. That does take time, frankly. I think you're seeing some of that. People are treading lightly, but over time, continuing to invest in this, I think, does provide a good platform for addressing really sensitive issues like you raised.
Thank you so much. Yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Chairman Cicilline. We now proceed to Congressman Rich McCormick of Georgia.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm going to make this quick because each one of you brings such a wealth of knowledge. I'm really excited about this. I'm going to start with General, if you don't mind. I-2U2, are you familiar with the I-2U2?
I'm not sure that I
With
am.
India, Israel, United States, and UAE, the partnership they have, sharing information, sharing economy, and just kind of thinking outside the box with what we had with Abraham, and thinking outside even the regional benefit of the Abraham. As we tie in other places, you have a big country like Indonesia, which is primarily Muslim, and who also has the potential to come in and be a part of this greater peace process. What do you think about expanding this outside of the direct region?
I think it's extraordinarily important in my view. Again, I think the benefit of these types of accords, these types of arrangements, is they promote dialogue and they promote communication between partners. And I think whenever you're doing that, you're reducing risk for things happening. So I'm very, very supportive. I understand Indonesia is one of the countries that has been most engaged to date in some of the expansion. So I think that's a positive thing. That said, the priority needs to remain in the Middle East.
Absolutely.
That's
I
where
just-
the original problem really exists.
Perfect, and I agree with you. Power in numbers, especially with such a large population of the Muslim community coming on board in that peace process. Honorable Mr. Greenway, by the way, thank you for both of your services too, by the way, as fellow military brothers in arms. When we talk about the second largest Shia population in the world next to Iran being in Azerbaijan, and having Russia distracted with a war where they've basically withdrawn from the Armenian region, provides a real neat opportunity, I think, to kind of go in there and establish this presence. What are the holdups or what are the pros and cons, do you think, to including Azerbaijan, and how could we get them folded in quickly while Russia is distracted?
Thank you, Congressman. Excellent question. And your preceding one was, I think, as well. I think that, well, first, Azerbaijan already has a strong relationship with Israel, and so membership of the Accords will be more formal and symbolic than substantive because of the relationship they already enjoy. To your broader point on whether there is a room for us to pull Azerbaijan, I would argue other Central Asian states more closely within the fold at the expense of Russia and China, which I think would be their strong preference. I think there is, in fact, an opportunity for us to do exactly that. And I think the time is certainly ripe for it. And we would, I think, increase our flexibility and also economic prosperity for ourselves and also for the region. The benefit of looking outside the Middle East, particularly the Middle East, North Africa, to Asia and to the Central Asian states, is the economic benefit that ties them together, increases the bond then endures. So I think any effort we can make along those lines would be beneficial.
That's perfect, and I always stress that economic tie, which kind of goes to I-2U2 and with the other, especially you mentioned Azerbaijan's strong economic ties to Israel, especially with energy, so that's what I'm looking for. Ambassador, I'm going to shift back to more local concerns. You mentioned in your opening remarks the deteriorating relationship between Israel and Palestine. I've been in the military for over 30 years, or around the military for over 30 years. It always seemed bad to me. I don't see how we can deteriorate from bad to bad. I'm just curious what you mean by that. I mean, it always seems like we kind of vacillate, but we never really get good. So I don't understand what you mean by deteriorating. What specifically do you mean? I mean, is there a path for, it seems like there's a vested interest since a certain guy came along to divide us. People actually make a profit off of dividing us. And I don't know how we overcome that other than to tie them in somehow economically. One time it seemed like they were kind of the blue-collar workers. We had a pretty good relationship, pretty economically sound model for that particular demographic to succeed, and now that's kind of gone by the wayside.
Congressman, it's obviously a situation that does go through ups and downs and various cycles. I don't think anyone would dispute that the recent months have seen a spike in violence, a number of deadly terrorist attacks by Palestinian terrorists against Israeli citizens, a number of operations the Israeli military has undertaken to go after those who are responsible for those attacks, and sometimes civilians are wounded in those or killed in those operations.
I get your point. I'm sorry, I'm almost out of time. What do you think if we, once again, I think Iran is, if you take away the big brother, the person who's kind of supplying the motivation, the arms behind it, is there a way to divide them from that and cut off that supply that would benefit this process?
The I think the best opportunity, and I'm not saying that anybody can promise that this is a guarantee of success, but to get Palestinians who have been drawn toward violent extremism, drawn toward the sponsors who are the providers of that kind of weaponry. And I don't mean Hamas, who are ideologically committed to Israel's destruction. I mean other Palestinians who have in the past at least considered what would it look like to live alongside Israel in a two-state solution, would be to, first of all, show some improved conditions on the ground by economic and security upgrades, and second of all, to show that there is a horizon, a path, a diplomatic pathway that could get back to that outcome if they're willing, and obviously if Israel is also willing to engage in that diplomatic process. As long as it looks absolutely hopeless, from the Palestinian perspective, that there will ever be any end, then I suspect it will be harder for us to steer more Palestinians away from that path, as we absolutely should be trying to do.
Apologize for going over time.
And thank you very much, Congressman Rich Burchett. We now proceed to to Rich McCormick. And we now, Congressman Tim Burchett of Tennessee.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Ambassador Shapiro, you know, we're quick to be critical of anti-Semitism overseas, and we should. We've got it here, but of course, overseas, it's been thousands of years before we were even a country. I'm wondering, what can the Abraham Accords do to help put a stop to some of it?
Thank you, Congressman. It's an excellent question and something I'm quite excited about. In December, our N7 initiative hosted a conference in Morocco on education and coexistence, and we brought together from 8 countries, Israel and 7 Arab countries, educators and NGOs involved in coexistence and interfaith work, including a number of Arab activists in Morocco and in the UAE and in Bahrain who are working to educate their own populations against anti-Semitic narratives that have been present in their societies or their education systems for far too long, for understanding the common roots of Judaism and Islam and the times during history when Jews and Muslims have lived peacefully alongside each other. There's a lot of pride in that, particularly in Morocco, where the Jewish community has been a major part of Moroccan society for centuries. So I think there are initiatives underway. There's Holocaust education now being brought into their school systems, at least the UAE and Morocco, for the first time. So there's significant progress, and all of this is made possible by the dialogues and the cross pollination discussions that were only really started after the Abraham Accords came into being.
Would you say that leadership sometimes, I find that they want to stay in power, and that seems to be the key, and as long as Jews and Muslims and Christians are all fighting, it keeps the same old bunch of dirtbags in power. And would you say that's a safe assumption?
I think there are many examples of that dynamic throughout history.
Dirtbags is probably not in your diplomatic dossier, but it is in mine. So
I think, Congressman, you can find many examples of that dynamic throughout history.
all right, I'll take that as a yes. Mr. Greenway, Saudi Arabia's interest to engage publicly with Israel affects other countries that might be interested in do you feel like they're interested in normalizing those relations?
Thanks for the question, Congressman. We've had a number of conversations with our Saudi partners while we were negotiating the Abraham Accords, before and since. I would say first that public discussions about negotiations tend to increase negotiating leverage of one or more parties, usually becomes detrimental. It's why the accords themselves were never disclosed or announced before they were concluded. So I think any public discussion usually has a less than productive impact on it. My private and conversations disclosed publicly, I think, generally concludes with the conclusion that this is really about the Riyadh-Washington relationship and has a lot less to do with the relationship with Israel. And on sound footing, I think there's room to proceed. I think ultimately it is in our interests, the United States' best interest. I think it's certainly within Israel's best interest. I think it's also within the kingdom's best interest. But I do think that we'd have to repair the relationship and build on a sounder footing in order to proceed. Ultimately, I do think it's about integrating our partners and allies in the region, which I think they desperately want. And I do think that there's certainly room to address legitimate security concerns. And into previous comments about the Saudi discussion and potential requirement to pursue civil nuclear cooperation, I think the general point there is they don't want to see a standard upheld by the United States that is one way for Tehran and another way for partners and allies in the region. And I think they would be comfortable with the gold standard 123 agreement that saw the construction of Baraka and the UAE ultimately, provided that the United States did not enable a wholesale civil and military nuclear program in Tehran.
Do you think there's any additional measures that need to be taken to support peace besides those that you mentioned?
Well, I think there certainly are. And again, I think providing for our security and stability in the region and our partners and allies would demonstrate exactly that level of commitment. I think the right approach on Tehran as the shared upon and agreed upon principal threat to peace and stability in the region would go a long way towards doing that. So I think if we make movement in that direction, I think we'll find partners moving with us.
What do you think America sees by expanding these accords? What benefits quickly?
The first is to constrain China's ambitions globally. The second is to secure global markets upon which we're dependent and the principal beneficiary. And the third would be to see a stability in a region that all too often has required a huge expenditure from the United States to redress.
Those are three good things. Mr. Chairman, I yield back the remaining 8 seconds.
And thank you, Congressman Tim Burchett. We appreciate your very accurate terminology, whatever you use. So this is correct. With this, we're very fortunate to have Congressman Michael Lawler from New York.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you to all of you for testifying today. Ambassador Shapiro, you made a note in your remarks of the legislation that Congressman Torres and I have introduced to create a special envoy specifically for the Abraham Accords. Why do you believe that would be an effective tool, if you will, to help ensure the stability and long-term success of the Abraham Accords?
Thank you, Congressman. I think when administrations elevate their focus on particular areas and appointments of that nature, special envoy that can have other titles, can help do that. It demonstrates a very significant commitment that gets the attention of our foreign partners, obviously those in the region, those who have already made their decision to normalize with Israel and the additional steps that we seek to have them deepen those conversations, those states that have not yet normalized relations, and there's a focal point for discussions with those countries, and even for external partners. Mr. McCormick mentioned the I2U2 initiative that India has constructively contributed to. Well, we have a lot of other U.S. partners in Europe, in Asia, that also could be contributors, but somebody needs to sort of corral that, somebody needs to organize that, somebody needs to be the focal point. And then within our own government, I mentioned it's not just the State Department, it's not just the Defense Department that has to do this. There's numerous other cabinet departments that have something to contribute. But again, having a focal point for organizing all of that effort and even the effort of external non-government entities that want to contribute, I think is made easier when you have that sort of focal point.
So obviously in 2020, the Abraham Accords were entered into with the UAE, Bahrain, Morocco. They've somewhat, I don't want to say stalled, but obviously I think there was obviously a change in administration here, and there are other events that have happened in the world. Obviously, the Russian invasion of Ukraine being one of them. It is your belief that whether it's a special envoy or some sort of heightened position, that would help maybe continue to push this forward towards success. I mean, we're seeing, other countries allowing Israeli airlines to operate and come into their airspace, which certainly I think is a positive step towards more normalized relations. But you agree that ultimately having this type of position or something similar would help advance the ball here?
I do. I want to give full credit to the Biden administration. I think they have invested in this. I think the Negev summit and the resulting Negev forum and the working groups that have met. I think you've mentioned the opening of airspace, first in Saudi Arabia, now in Oman, that facilitates much shorter flights between Israel and the Far East. Some of the other visits and the I2U2 and some of the other engagements that the United States has helped sponsor. all result from good work, good diplomatic work, but again, you can do even more when you have a high-level focal point within our own government and dealing with foreign governments.
What additional countries would you, and just if you could name them, not just in the interest of time, but what additional countries would you like to see ideally enter into the Abraham Accords?
Of course, Saudi Arabia is the biggest prize, but probably one of the most difficult. I think Oman, Mauritania, Qatar, and Kuwait are all possibilities. And outside of the region, Indonesia, Somalia, Niger, and Malaysia are also legitimate candidates.
Okay. Lastly, and you're somewhat uniquely positioned on this, given both your role as former ambassador to Israel, but also your work as a consultant with respect to Iran. How do you think the administration's approach towards Iran and their efforts as recently as last year to restart the Iran nuclear deal impact the Abraham Accords and the potential of other countries like Saudi Arabia to really engage with Israel?
Well, you know, one thing Israel and a number of these Arab partners, those that have normalized, those that have not, agree on is that they disagree with the United States. They disagreed at the time the JCPOA was signed, and they disagreed with the Biden administration's approach. But I think that, to try to re-enter it, but I think that ship has largely sailed. I don't see an opportunity to go back into that deal. Things that were possible or necessary in order to do it, or I don't think are possible anymore in light of Iran's oppression of its own people in the protests and arming of Russia in the war in Ukraine. So I think we're in a new phase.
Just so I'm clear, is it your position that the United States should not try to restart?
I don't think it's even an option at this point. I think we're in a new phase where deterrence, and that's something that the United States, Israel, and a lot of these Arab partners can agree on, is going to be a central portion, a central component of a new Iran policy, obviously drawing certain lines about things that Iran might do, hopefully will not do, but if they would do, would draw a response of one kind or another from one or a coalition of these partners. So I think there's actually a new opportunity, mostly because of Iran's behavior and Iran's refusal to try to return to that agreement and then do all of these other destabilizing things to coalesce a more unified U.S. and regional policy to deal with Iran.
Thank you. Mr. Chairman, thank you for the additional time.
And thank you very much, Congressman Michael Lawler. And also, I'm really grateful that we have the co-chairman of the Bulgaria caucus here, Congressman Brad Schneider.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I want to personally thank you for allowing me to join the committee hearing this morning. I want to thank our witnesses, first and foremost, for your service to our nation, all three of you in different ways. We are grateful to you as a country, and for your time here and your commitment to the Abraham Accords. I have the privilege of being one of the co-founders and co-chairs of the bipartisan, bicameral Abraham Accords caucus, and I think that is a reflection of what we do, what you do, in this fundamental belief that the Abraham Accords caucus are one of the most bright things we see coming out of the Middle East. It is something that we as a nation should be extraordinarily proud of, being the facilitator of this Accords a couple of years ago, and something that we need to be completely committed to. As you have touched on, we need to make sure that we are deepening the roots of the Accords in the countries that have signed the Accords today, while at the same time, I would argue, working to help it branch out in two ways that you've touched on. One, bring more countries in. Saudi Arabia obviously would be very welcome. But Ambassador Shapiro, as you touched on, reaching out to Europe, building relationships with Asia, and making sure that this becomes a centerpiece of diplomacy and opportunity. In that vein, I think one of the challenges we face is demonstrating the value of the Abraham Accords, first to the decision makers in the region and around, but also critically to the people living in these countries, that they see the benefits of the Accords, and to demonstrate U.S. commitment to the region and through it, that commitment to the Accords. So I'll start with you, Ambassador Shapiro. How do we work to make sure that the people living in the region see the value of the Accords, and that they see the U.S. commitment to the region and to the Abraham Accords itself?
Sure. Thank you, Congressman. The Negev Forum obviously is one effort to try to come up with projects and proposals that will go beyond the leadership level but show benefit to the public in the different sectors: energy, health, water, and food, et cetera. The problem is the Negev Forum is a consensus organization. It moves very slowly. It takes time for the ministers to meet again and ratified work done at the working level. And so there's a lot of proposals, but very little has actually been implemented. Those things that have been implemented haven't been region-wide. They've been sort of between individual countries. UAE-Israel Free Trade Agreement. I mentioned the Prosperity Green and Blue Israel-Jordan-UAE Agreement. We're, as I said, at the Atlantic Council trying the N7 initiative to bring together a track 2 or track 1.5 component to run parallel to the Negev Forum so that a broader community of experts can build a network, develop ideas and, for projects that really are focused precisely on that. How does a citizen of one of these countries feel that they have a new educational opportunity, a new better health care, better access to water and food security than they did before and because of these agreements? So there's a number of ways. It requires a lot of investment by expertise. It requires money, of course, some from government, some from private or foundation or philanthropic entities. But that really needs to be the focus going forward.
General Votel, let me turn to you. And just to refresh, we actually spoke about a year and a half ago, mutual friend Al Goldstein. So it's good to see you here. But I'd love to have your thoughts on this as well.
Yeah, absolutely. Just to build a little bit on that, I think one of the most important things that could take place is the promotion of people-to-people exchanges and contact between the countries. Obviously, tourism provides an opportunity for this, but so does exchanges for education purposes, for business purposes, for healthcare, for technology exchanges. I think these are extraordinarily important, and people in each of the countries who are parties to the agreement will begin to see this. And so I think this idea of promoting people-to-people exchanges, certainly there's a series of exercises and other things that are taking place in the Gulf and in the air over the Gulf and in a variety of areas. A demonstration of an effective defense against a threat certainly I think, is something that needs to be emphasized in the region. And again, people will begin to see that.
All right, thank you. And Mr. Greenway, I'll give you the last word.
Appreciate it, Congressman. Excellent question. I think we spend a lot of our time on implementation. There have been over 260 agreements between the Accord member countries, and we spend most of our time connecting ministries, departments, agencies, public and private institutions to execute these. Academic exchanges, including Scholars and Fellows Program, athletic events, which will encompass some of the first international Abraham Accords-based international athletic events this year, an agricultural initiative between the Accord member countries, actually putting shovels in the ground in Sudan this year, expanding cross-border trade by expanding the infrastructure, and as you mentioned earlier, bringing external support to this. We've worked hard to build caucuses in the UK, in France, in Germany, in Brussels, in Hungary just this past week, and soon we hope in other countries as well, and in Asia, in order to leverage that support. So implementation and follow-through on agreements that already been achieved, I think will go a long way towards cementing the ties, demonstrating the benefit to people, and encouraging others to join.
Great, thank you. And let me just emphasize, I agree with everything you said. General Votel, you talked about people-to-people. We've had the chance here with the caucus to meet with the ambassadors from the Abraham Accords countries, Israel, UAE, Bahrain, Morocco. It's very important. And if I can, Mr. Chairman, we're working to try to get a trip to the Abraham Accords country and would love to try to work with you on that as well. And with that, I yield back.
And thank you, Chairman, co-chair of the Abraham Accord Caucus, you've had so many chairmanships, it's hard to keep them straight. But I just want to, that's terrific. And in fact, you're doing so good, we're going to have a second round. And when we have such distinguished individuals here, and so we'd like to proceed, including Chairman Schneider. So we, at this time, Ambassador Shapiro, the normalization of relations between Israel and UAE, Bahrain, Morocco, and Sudan have been an historic accomplishment during the Trump administration, benefiting all of the Abraham Accords countries and the United States. At this point, what roadblocks might be stopping more Arab countries from joining the Abraham Accords? And if you could review again the benefits that signatories have made since normalizing relations.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. The benefits, I think, are flowing on a regular basis. There are already people-to-people exchanges that General Votel mentioned, although room for vast expansion of those. They're the beginnings of educational exchanges, Israeli students studying at Arab universities and vice versa. There's room to dramatically expand that as well. There is a free trade agreement between the UAE and Israel, and a dramatic increase in bilateral trade between them, and negotiations on an Israel-Bahrain agreement. And then, of course, there are the various things that those governments sought from the United States. Again, something that the United States has always done in Arab-Israeli peacemaking, which is make a contribution. The UAE sought a particular weapon system. It hasn't actually followed through on that, but that was a part of that agreement. Morocco got the recognition of Western Sahara. So they, of course, seek something in their own interest in addition to what they get out of the relationship with Israel. I think other countries, of course, look at some of those negotiations and they look for the right moment. They look for the question of whether they, too, would be in a bargaining situation with the United States. I think we need to expect that with any country that comes forward. They also, I think, look for the moment when they would find this to be something they could most easily absorb in their own political systems. That's where the tensions between Israelis and Palestinians that have increased have also, I think, been have the potential to slow additional countries from coming into the fold.
Thank you very much. And indeed, President Greenway, it's just been awesome to see the agreement between Lebanon and Israel. I can't even visualize how important that is for the offshore drilling of oil and natural gas, environmentally sound, how important it is to back up a country that should be great, but it's not, is Lebanon. It has been great in terms of economic opportunity and achievement, but the economic stability that can be achieved by the sale of oil and gas. And then how extraordinary to put together the benefit to Israel, and then the thought that this would tie directly to Egypt for the refining, and then tie to Italy for the export, and also to have an impact on war criminal Putin. And so, again, the offshore drilling, I was hoping to get more attention, what an achievement that is, because what you have, Lebanon wins, Israel wins, Egypt wins, Italy wins, war criminal Putin loses. Are there any other initiatives that you see that, it'll be hard to replicate that, but are there any other economic achievements that could be achieved between the countries of the Middle East?
Well, you bring up, I think, one of the most important areas, Chairman, and that is energy cooperation. And I think we haven't yet seen the full potential of this. And so while cooperation between parties you've already mentioned, chiefly Israel and Egypt in this case, but others within the Mediterranean, can, I think, offset and replace the loss of Russian gas. Some 43% of Europe's energy requirements were met previously by Russia. That loss has not been replaced. There isn't yet infrastructure plans in place to offset it completely. The United States, Norway, and others, I think, have taken steps, but there is not yet a mid to long-term plan in place. This is where we judge the Abraham Accord countries, including Israel, Egypt, and other partners, could in fact offset, if not replace, the loss of Russian gas to Europe. And I think the U.S. can play a critical role in doing it. The plans previously existed, but the business model to require the infrastructure investment didn't until Russia invaded Ukraine. And at that point, it then becomes perfectly reasonable. But it will take time, effort, and to do. It will be enormous revenue generator for the participant countries. It will also, again, strategically align our partners to one another and not dependent upon an adversary. So we can't emphasize the enormous potential of this too much, but there's a lot of work to be done.
Well, it's just exciting to see the offshore drilling, the consequence that could be expanded to pipelines to Greece, Bulgaria, Romania, to the Western Balkans, all to provide for energy independence for that region of southeastern Europe. And so I yield back, and now we have Congresswoman Kathy Manning.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And thank you again to our witnesses for sharing your time and your expertise. So there are two other countries in the immediate region that we have barely mentioned, and Mr. Chairman just mentioned Lebanon, which sadly is on the verge of becoming a failed state, and we haven't even talked about Syria, which is the source of countless problems in the region. So I'm wondering, is there any way that the Abraham Accords countries working together can have any positive impact on either of those countries? I saw a smile on Ambassador Shapiro's face. I don't know if that meant you were hoping someone else would answer the question, or you would like to take it on.
Well, I think I think it's an excellent question, Congresswoman, and I think the security and defense cooperation between Israel and other countries in the region, particularly those that are involved in this, I think does increase the opportunity to place measures that can have an impact on Iran's ability to move their lethal resources closer to Israel. That's very indirect right now. But I think when we look at some of the initiatives that are being undertaken right now by U.S. Central Command with a very excellent commander of trying to, create a series of sensors and drones and all backed by artificial intelligence to really understand what is happening in the Gulf, that gives us the opportunity to better control the maritime movement of lethal aid. The same thing could apply to the air. These things, I think, they're indirect at this point, but they could have the opportunity to have an impact on that. I think what's most important, I think, that I'm trying to emphasize to you is that showing a united front and then demonstrating coherent approaches to security and defense in the region can address that situation and particularly with respect to some of the Iranian malign influence that plays out in Syria and affects Israel and others in the region as well.
Thank you. So let me ask this question. What can we be doing in Congress to support and foster the expansion of the Abraham Accords? You've talked about so many ways these interaction of these countries and the interaction of these transformative and can be even more transformative for the region. What can we in Congress be doing to be supportive? And I'd actually ask each of you to answer that. And Ambassador Shapiro, would you mind starting?
Sure. Thank you, Congresswoman. I think that, first of all, the establishment of the Abraham Accords caucuses in and of itself demonstrates that this is a cause that deserves bipartisan, sustained investment and support rather than being the province of one party or one administration. And I think that's very, very important. The visits that a number of members have already made, and Congressman Schneider referenced additional visits that will come, are an opportunity to go and talk directly to those leaders and people and explain why it is that the United States sees its own interests and the interests of its partners served by doing this. And then, as I also indicated, there's more than just the negotiations that the State Department sponsors, more than just the security cooperation that the Defense Department and the military lead on. Almost every department of the U.S. government has an international affairs program, has something to bring to it, things as diverse as USTR's expertise on trade negotiations, the U.S. Holocaust Memorials Museum's ability to bring curriculum on Holocaust education, the Center for Disease Control's ability to share, provide information and networks for sharing about future pandemics. These are just few examples, but every member of Congress sits on a committee and has oversight over, has jurisdiction over a department that could be encouraged and maybe even more than encouraged and then funded to participate in this. And kind of this whole of government approach, I think, would be the right way to think about how the Congress can make its biggest contribution.
Wonderful. Mr. Schneider, you have your charge. And Mr. Greenway, would you add to that?
Yes, Congressman, happy to. It already mentioned energy cooperation, the free trade area, and like Ambassador Shapiro would allow the formation of the caucus in both House and Senate. I would say that the United States allocates a fair amount of money towards Middle East peace more broadly and has for many decades. And I would say no need to look at additional appropriations, but perhaps ensuring those that currently exist could encompass the Abraham Accords. So we spend a lot of money on supporting programs that nominally support peace between Israel and Palestine and Israel and its neighbors, but we don't allocate resources towards it. So perhaps looking at existing legislation and modifying it to encompass the accords so that we could encourage and support the actual peace that's manifest in front of us. Second is, I think, providing capabilities to our partners enables them, one, to defend themselves more appropriately and reduces the burden on us. So ultimately, I think we need to get to a point where we're more comfortable with accelerating the provision of capabilities to our partners, and it'll send exactly the right message to them. But I would emphasize that trade and energy and the economic argument does provide for a strong rationale. If we want them to get along, they're going to have to trade with each other to the point where they'll defend that trade relationship.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Thank you very much, Congresswoman Manning, and I want to thank you for raising, indeed, there's so many countries that need to be addressed, and Lebanon, Syria, as we're thinking of the tremendous success, the Kingdom of Jordan, and then our hopes for the people of Iraq, our appreciation of the women of Iran, and then West Balkans, when you think of countries that have come to life, Albania, North Macedonia, and then you go to Serbia. What great opportunity for stability in a region that was unimaginable. And so with that, I want to proceed. And our last questioner is going to be, of course, somebody extremely important, because he's the Abraham Accords co-chairman, Brad Schneider.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And General Votel, let me go back to what you put in your opening remarks, but the importance of U.S. leadership and the question I asked earlier, the demonstration of U.S. commitment to the region. And start with you, but I'll ask the whole panel. What should we be doing to demonstrate our commitment and leadership in the region? And I'll give one leading aspect to it, the idea of coordinated defense, sharing of information, collaboration across systems.
Yeah, thank you, Congressman, or Mr. Chairman. These are areas in which we have extraordinary expertise within our military and across all services. And so, in helping our partners develop better shared awareness systems, being able to share information among themselves, as we have been able to do very effectively, I think, is one of the ways that we can help our partners become more resilient and more self-reliant in looking after their own defense. So, sharing our lessons learned, sharing our practices, putting our leaders into a place where they can advocate for these types of approaches, I think are really important. I also think an area where we could provide some additional help is in the area of security cooperation. Candid discussions with our partners about the capabilities that they need and should be acquiring, I think, are extraordinarily important. And this, I think, has been a long-time challenge in the region. And so this is an area where we can actually demonstrate some leadership. And then finally, just the ability for us to bring people together, to be a convener. We don't have to drive the whole conversation, but the fact of the matter is, in the Middle East, when the United States speaks, it carries weight, and our leaders, like the CENTCOM commander or our various ambassadors or others, really do have that level of credibility that they can bring people together to talk about the difficult challenges. So this idea of a convener, I think, is a really important way for us to demonstrate our leadership.
Great, thank you. Ms. Greenway.
Thank you, Congressman. I would say, first, it's come up before that if we don't, I think, have some common agreement on how to approach the threat from Iran, it's going to be difficult to make progress across a number of other fronts, including security cooperation. We've talked about a number of issues today, but I can't overemphasize the fact that this is the most pressing threat to all of them. What happens in the Israel-Palestine conflict matters to them, but not nearly to the point in which the immediate threat to their very survival coming from Tehran today is, and the desperate need for U.S. leadership in the response to that threat. That is a huge opportunity, and I agree with Ambassador Shapiro that it seemed that the ship has sailed. It's an opportunity then for us, I think, to stake a claim in partnership with our allies in the region, and that would allow us to convene from a position of strength, which I think they all and we want. Second, I would say our support for Israel is critically important during this time. The rest of the region watches this incredibly closely. They can't be more pro-Israel than we are. That doesn't mean unequivocal or without conditions. It does mean if there's daylight between the capitals, there'll be huge daylight between their capitals. Second, I would say that building support abroad, which we've talked about actually matters a great deal and adds additional leverage and other partners in this expanding and supporting the Accords. And last, I would say they always ask this question. We ask them to commit resources towards each other and toward the region. They ask us, what have we committed to the Abraham Accords? And the answer to that question is we really haven't at all. And I think that there's room for us to do it. And I'm not saying that we need to find resources. I'm saying we could look at existing resources and apply them more effectively to support the Accords. And that, to date, has not yet occurred.
Okay, thank you. And I'll give you the last word, Ambassador Shapiro. Before I give it to you, I do want to go back to a conversation earlier where you were asked about two states. And I don't think anyone is talking about a two-state solution on the horizon. It is not going to be a second state where it is a terrorist state that is a non-starter. And as you said, Mr. Greenaway, the greatest threat, the existential threat, is a nuclear Iran. And I agree that the ship has sailed on past agreements. We need to make sure Iran understands that we're looking forward and we'll never allow Iran to have a nuclear weapon. But we are also looking at a place where we're pursuing peace in the region. So, our Ambassador Shapiro, I give you the last word.
Thank you, Congressman. I think the narrative that sometimes pervades in the region of a U.S. withdrawal or U.S. absence or U.S. pivoting to other regions is rather exaggerated. It is true, of course, that 3 consecutive presidents of very different characters and administrations have all demonstrated different ways the American people are not looking for new major military entanglements in the region, but we're still there. CENTCOM is still the main convener and still the main partner for all these countries, Israel now involved in it. I think President Biden made a very courageous decision and the right decision to travel to the region last summer, knowing he'd get some criticism for going and meeting with the Saudis, but as a way of indicating to all of these countries that we may have had some disagreements and we may have at times different views about what the right approach is on a given problem, but the United States is committed to that partnership, is committed to ensuring that the partners have the ability to defend themselves, but also that we are there as an ultimate backstop. But then, of course, we also have expectations that they will act in ways that are consistent with core U.S. interests when it comes to China, when it comes to Russia, when it comes to oil markets. So being a good, faithful partner that expects the flow of that partnership to go in both directions, I think is critically important. And finally, I would just add that I do think that when you get to moments like the current one, where there is a deterioration between Israelis and Palestinians, that can be destabilizing for Jordan. That can be difficult for Egypt. That can be a source of tension between Israel and new partners and preventive from progress between Israel and partners that haven't yet joined with them. And there too, showing that the United States is invested in that, cares, tries to improve the situation long before it's possible to actually negotiate it toward a solution, so that both Israelis and Palestinians, but also everyone in that circle, broader circle that's affected by those events, sees some U.S. commitment and investment to trying to improve the situation, also adds to our leadership capability in the region.
Thank you. I appreciate all you do. Look forward to working with you, Mr. Chairman. I'm glad to be back and glad to work together as well.
And again, thank you, Congressman Brad Schneider, for your vision to create the bipartisan Abraham Accords caucus. And another point that you just made is so important, and that is that it's bipartisan, that there be every effort that can possibly be made for Iran not to achieve nuclear weapons. What a threat that would be to world stability. And so it's bipartisan, truly, here, of support of every effort to block the ability of Iran to have nuclear weapons. With that, I want to thank the witnesses for their valuable testimony and the members for their questions. The members of the subcommittee may have some additional questions for the witnesses, and we will ask you to respond to those in writing. And with this, we are adjourned. You survived.
I survived.
Hey, hey.